Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to the 10 Chapters Apart podcast. I'm your host, Steven, joined by my co-host, Jason. And now is when I would usually ask Jason how he's doing, but we don't care because we have a new guest with us today. David, who is our good friend. David was part of Jason's small group for the past year or the 2 years ago. And so we have him on. David, welcome. Do you want to introduce yourself a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. As was stated, my name is David. I am a recent graduate. Got my undergrad, writing off the most anticlimactic high probably of recent years. Good old quarantine, but it was been great. So besides that, so I'm mechanical engineering, so that kind of gives you a thought of how I think about things. But I also really love theology and learning about God. Listen to sermons often on my free time, and so I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to get into some good and juicy topics.
And David, what's maybe some of your background behind Christianity? Have you been a Christian for a good part of your life? Or?
Yeah, so a lot of I similar to a lot of my friends, I grew up, in a Christian family. Both my parents became Christians when they moved here to the States before they had my sister and I. So I grew up in a Christian family, and it was great. I did like the whole, Sunday school, Awanas, uh, all that kind of stuff. But I think it wasn't really until my teen years that I really started to make my faith my own. I think it's pretty common, actually. You talk to a lot of people. I think, growing up, you're like, oh yeah, yes, Jesus loves me and all these great things. But I don't think, one of the, I think we'll talk about this later today in our topic, but we talk about, like sin and like the gravity of that sin. And I'm still struggling with even realizing that on a day-to-day basis. But, I don't think you can't see how good the gospel is without understanding how horrible and how, what sin does to you and how sin really affects you. So it wasn't really until I think, teen years with a little bit more of that introspection that I was able to kind of have a greater appreciation and a more fuller understanding of who God is, what Christ did, and why that's important.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, like so many people that have come and guests on this show have the same experience. Like Jason and I both have very similar experiences where I think growing up, you reach a point, right, where you kind of grasp this like, oh, how much does this all matter to me, like in the grand scheme of things? Whereas sin and salvation kind of play a role in you. Like I think that's a lot of very similar stories. So it's very relatable, David. Jason, you had a topic that you wanted to kind of cover today? Something that was eating at you?
I've been thinking a lot recently about um, sort of this paradox of Christianity where we are all sinners, and the Bible is very straightforward in acknowledging that we all mess up, and yet the this religion that we subscribe to says like you need to be like Jesus, who we know has been like the only perfect human. So this is something that I've been wrestling a lot with recently, but I mean, I think this is something that everyone wrestles with, right? Just this idea of like Jesus sets this impossibly high standard, and how can I ever hope to get there? And um, I know for me personally, probably for all of us, since we all want to be like achievers, that can be really discouraging to have this impossibly high standard set. But trying to figure out how to navigate that and still continue moving forward, knowing that you're always going to be set back. Like, is that something that you guys have also experienced in your walks with God?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think both. I think for me personally, and also like seeing it in my friend's life and knowing how to relate and knowing how to support each other for sure. I think it's very, I think there's two sides of the spectrum. I think there's those who are like, yeah, I got my, free ticket into heaven, and you're like, oh, grace upon grace, and it's all great. And then you're like, but then like nothing really changes, and you're like, oh, okay. And then you have others who are just who who understand that they're flawed, but that becomes almost like a tripping point to them, and they can't seem to get over that. And instead of being able to healthily address that and and know how to work with that, they kind of just like shove it deep down, and they kind of refuse to look at that and like, well, if I do all these other good Christian things, maybe these flaws aren't going to be as big of an issue, or we can kind of just not have to think about that skeleton in the closet. And it's knowing how to balance those two views to bring it into that perfect middle where you have that sense of healthiness. Oh yeah, it's incredibly hard.
Yeah, I definitely agree on the side of like how to find that balance, like knowing that I think definitely when you become saved and you become a Christian, the weight of sin feels a lot heavier to you. Like you understand how imperfect you are and how amazing and perfect and holy God is. And so any like sin to you um really becomes hard to get over. It's not something that we can put to the back of our minds anymore. We have to really address it and kind of know we know that we're not perfect, but we're striving for perfection. We're striving for holiness, and it's very hard to go down the battle because anytime I tend to be one of the persons that's like very perfectionist. Like my standard, my bar is like perfection, and so I never really feel satisfied or I don't feel like joy when I guess like I am doing well, or like to me doing well and not sinning and walking in that Christian lifestyle is like the normal for me. So anytime when I mess up, yeah, when I mess up, then I'm like kind of below the bar, and it really gets to me, and that's something that is uh, really hard to come back from because I'll mess up and I'll sin, and then like I need to remind myself that is really God's grace that is like playing the biggest role here. It's not myself, and I can still come back to God and ask for forgiveness. But it's very like for me, it tends to be very hard to come back to the point. It just
Mhm.
feels like it feels a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, feeling like I messed up, even though like, and I don't know if it's because I've been a Christian for such a long time, but I feel like I ought to be have overcome some things uh, already, and I haven't, and it just feels like I've messed up too badly.
Yeah, and that's hard because it feels like no matter where you put like this bar for yourself, you're just like doomed for failure because so like in your case, Stephen, it's like, okay, the bar is Jesus. You're never gonna get there. Just like
Yeah, yeah,
just
exactly.
not. And so it leaves you feeling unsatisfied and like I'm not good enough. But yet like we know that the Bible tells us like in God's eyes, because Jesus is our advocate, like we are good enough for him. And so it's like that's another thing to wrestle with. I feel like there's so many paradoxes wrapped up in this whole thing. But on the other side, if you're, you know, if you do have this bar that's like, if I get here, I'm good enough, then we know that's dangerous as well. Because if you're like becoming satisfied in like that position that you get to, then it probably means that you're like no longer hungry for Jesus, no longer hungry to continue pursuing righteousness, which the Bible also calls us to do.
So how do you find that balance then?
I think honestly, I think that like I think it's I think the bar should be Jesus, honestly, and we need to be content knowing that we're not going to get there because I think it's better to like be unsatisfied with yourself and have that as a motivator to continue striving for the godly example than to come to a place where it's like I'm there. I made it. And I think that that comes from sort of like a humble perspective and like a right perspective of who we are compared to God. But David, did you have something that you wanted to say to that?
Yeah, I was gonna say like so. I think if you look at in the Gospel of Matthew, right? Matthew 5:6-7 is the Beatitudes. I think it's 6-7, 5-7. It's the Sermon on the Mount. My bad, getting my terminology
Thank you.
mixed up here. I was like something's off, but the Beatitudes, right? That's kind of what kicks everything off. And if you look at traditional like Jewish culture, when Jesus started off with saying blessed are blah 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 blah. In traditional Jewish culture, you would have blessed are those who strive after God with all their heart, and for when men honor you for and all these things. Blessed are you, and Jesus completely does like a 180 on that. And he's like, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's this idea that it's completely different than what his Jewish audience at the time would be expecting. But it's kind of this idea that in some ways, like our Christian life here on this earth is that we should always be unsatisfied with what's, with ourselves and what the state of the world is. I forgot in which other uh, book slash chapter. My friend did taught a short sermon on this about, the earth is groaning, right? It wants to produce more fruit. It wants to be what it was pre-fall, but it can't because it's still in this fallen state. And for us as Christians, like we should be groaning as well. We should see that void and that gap of where we do not measure up, where we fall short, and where we miss that mark. And we should see that and we should be able to mourn and groan to do more and to become more like Christ. And I think that's a powerful statement, and this is going to be and I think this is something that I was thinking about. We talked about a little bit. Jason and I we talked a little about before this about what we're talking about. So last night I was thinking about this idea of perfection because this idea of perfection is not. This is something that every single person in the entire world deals with. Now, for perfection to be a thing, you have a law that you have to compare yourselves against to. And that's going to change depending on who you are and what your belief systems are. But we even see like okay, full disclosure, I'm a fairly, as far as political views, I'm being said the P word. I'm fairly moderate, but I was listening to an interesting podcast about this the other day, and it says like how like even on like the American atheistic left, right? Those who would say like I don't believe in God, no, it's it's us. There is still this idea of perfection. We see this in this whole cancel culture, where people's Twitters, people's tweets, old tweets and old videos gets dug up. And if you're not aligning with these perfect values that are laid out, oh, you're gone. It's this whole idea of like, yeah, in every culture, in every system in the world, there is a standard of what is right and what is wrong. And if you don't live up to that standard, oh, that's not good. And even in Christianity, right? If without Christ's saving grace, if you don't live up to that standard, it's not good for you, right? That's why the gospel is so important. So I think it's this interesting idea of how everyone I think intrinsically knows in their heart that they can't live up to that standard with whatever culture is telling them, whether it's in Christianity with doing what's here's the Ten Commandments, but even in going back to the atheistic left, right? Well, what is right and what's perfect always seems to be a moving target, but like they know, right, that they can't ever meet that standard. It's you're always trying to hit that, and I think it's how we approach that changes Christianity compared to other cultures, right? We have in a lot of world religions, it's all about works. It's that kind of that self-discipline, that that beating of oneself into a submission, and it's like you're trying to always make penance for all the wrong that you are doing. And I think in and even in a secular culture, it's the same thing. You're always trying to say the right thing, to compose yourself as the right person, to go through your old social media accounts and try and purge everything that isn't correct at the time. Whereas I think in Christianity, it's a different view where it's kind of what's I think the best part about sin is that's kind of a strange thing, but sin levels the playing field, right? Like Jesus said, he who is guilty of breaking one is breaking them all. So from the get-go, we're already on this playing field where everyone is equally screwed up, and we all have this understanding that everybody is equally, at least okay, we should all have an understanding that everyone is equally screwed up. And I think when we forget that, that is I think where we can kind of get that fissioning and division in our relationships within the church and even with society as itself, and where that call to be perfect becomes impossible, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I with the like to bring the church together, there has to be like we all have to understand that we're all like sinners, right? We can't expect each other to all be perfect. And and I think when we do, then we'll only be disappointed in each other. We're saying like, "Oh, why doesn't this person perform in the way that I expect them to? Why don't I perform in the way that I expect myself to?" And there has to be that kind of acceptance that, yeah, we aren't perfect. And I love that that is kind of the crux of Christianity. It's that we are imperfect. There's no saying that we're just going to try to work harder and harder to achieve this kind of nirvana state where we have no imperfections. Like Christianity is built on this idea that we are not perfect, but that we didn't have to be perfect because God sent Jesus down to save us even while we weren't perfect. It's not that like he saved us because we worked hard and became worthy of salvation. No, it was like while we were still imperfect, you know, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And that's just like that's such a beautiful picture. I think in just not only within the Christian world, but I think that's just a beautiful picture that many people across all kind of cultures will see, like the kind of sacrifice that Jesus gave on our behalf. The sacrifice of a perfect person for someone who is not perfect. And I think that that is um generally like a pretty romanticized like idea, like the idea of sacrifice. And the perfect example is here in the Bible that we see that Jesus had for us. And so getting back onto the topic of like ourselves and like how do we respond to that, and um like how do we integrate that into our lives? I think it helps us to understand or be more okay with ourselves and our imperfections. Not saying that we're okay staying there, but like allowing God to fully give us grace. And I still think that that's a hard thing to kind of wrap my head around and kind of accept. Um, but it definitely helps knowing that everyone is not going to be perfect. And yeah, I like the term that you said. It levels the playing field. There's none of us that can achieve that kind of perfection. We're all sinful.
Hmm. I love this idea that like in other world religions, it's like I am going to be as close as I can to perfect so that I can get to God, whatever the deity is. And in Christianity, it's flipped. It's like God came to me first, so now I'm going to try and live my life in such a way to honor him. Um, yeah. So, David, I want to bring attention to something that you said earlier that I thought was really interesting. You said in secular culture, there's this idea of like wanting to act put together, like wanting to always say the right thing. And I was actually thinking about our own, I guess, that within Christian culture. And I still feel like that plays a role a lot of the time. And especially all three of us are involved in student ministry. And I think that that's something I definitely see. And even amongst non-leaders, but this idea of like, when I come to church, when I come to large group gathering, when I come to Bible study, I want to be like super put together. I want to be like, I want to be perfect. I know that I have so many friends who like have struggles and they just like don't want to tell them to me because that's a hard thing to do and you don't want to admit weakness. And so I also want to sort of unpack that idea. I think that this is another thing that plays into the paradox is that, okay, one, we are not perfect. Two, we are trying to be perfect. And now there's this extra element of like, despite these first two things that everyone knows we are not perfect, but we're trying to be, we're like, I feel like sometimes we just act like we're perfect or we put on this facade of like, I'm invincible. And I don't know if this is like a cultural thing that needs changing or if this is just like a human nature thing, some combination thereof. But this is just another idea that I sort of wanted to bring up and discuss with the three of us.
I think there's something really funny because like this is actually, as you were speaking about that, I was thinking, and I think the funniest part about what you just said is that it happens on both sides, right? So you have people who like they refuse to share anything like deep and personal about their lives, right? And then you have like the other people, and I'm not trying to really rat on them because it can become from the right motivations, but we like I've done this before where you virtue signal so hard about like, oh, here's all the different ways that I used to sin, and it's like that other way of like, I'm such a humble Christian. I'm so willing to share about all my failures and all my mistakes. And I think the key in that is that there is a difference, and my friend and I have talked about this before, is that there's a difference between like I think everyone loves the stories, and everyone loves to share the stories about how I was this depraved sinner and God saved me. Emphasis on saved, past tense, right? Most people don't like to share the stories of where God is saving them, of where like last night I looked up stuff on the computer, and honestly, even today, I don't hate that as much as I know I should. Like that's what people don't like. Everyone wants to be like, oh yeah, I used to be, big into the party culture. It was horrible. It was horrible. But one day, God, hit me, and it was great. And then like there's that, and everyone's like, oh yeah, like you go, And then for everybody else who's like, man, I'm still stuck in that. That's super discouraging because you're like, that person has all his life put together somehow, and it feels like they're closer to being perfect because it's like they preceded it with being, here's all the ways that I wasn't perfect, and now everything's great. And then for everybody else who's like, I can't say that about me. And I think it is that idea of being open and honest about how much your life is, how far off you currently are. Everyone likes to share about their success stories and their victory stories. No one likes to say that, I've been dealing with this and this sin, and I have not been able, and it feels like I'm stuck in that brutal cycle where I'm not able to break out. And that's a much harder thing to share. And I think talking about like that cultural thing and versus human nature, I think it's definitely a mixture of both. And I think, for us, because we're Asian American, so we have, first of all, a different view. And for me, I wouldn't consider myself super Asian, but there is still that idea of honor and shame culture, right? That classic Asian honor and shame culture. Plus with the American culture of like, be the tough man, be the pioneer, that pioneering
Pull
spirit.
yourself up
Go,
by the bootstraps.
yeah, exactly. What does that even mean? That doesn't make any sense. But head west, head to the great unknown. Oh, you know, and so you have these two cultures, which oftentimes are very different. But in this case, it's like, yeah, don't be vulnerable. Like, especially for men, and like men in general, I think whether it's a cultural thing, whether it's just how we're wired, we're not really good at like emotional vulnerability. That's not where we tend to go to. We're just like, yeah, let's just punch each other, do a big bro hug, and we're good to go. So in that case, and I think that once again, that can though harm that sharing of vulnerability, of not being perfect. I remember quite vividly um, back in good old middle school days, right? A youth group retreat where we went off to this great little it was like a massive barn where we had like bunk beds. It was really cool. But and anyway, we had the there was for one of our sessions we split the guys and the girls off, and everyone's like, oh boy, like we know what's coming, right? So all the guys were sitting around a picnic table, and our youth leader like shares like his story about like porn and lust and all that kind of stuff. Hopefully me saying these words aren't going to like raise red flags on like the YouTube algorithms.
Demonetized. Thanks, David.
Demon ban it. No.
There goes our 3 cents.
Oh! I'll Venmo that to you guys. But like like those words come out, and then like every middle school boy is like, oh look, dear. It's like, oh look, like that's a nice
girls
tree.
circle. Actually, I don't really want to.
Like that's a nice trio over there, and it's just like this mass silence because everyone's so uncomfortable, even though like we statistically know, like for every guy, I mean like 99, it's extraordinarily high number, like like this idea of lust, and in our very digital age, it's a huge issue, and it's just so uncomfortable, and we tense up because it's like, I don't want to be seen. I don't want that silent feeling of judgment where I walk into a room and people look at you and they're like, oh, that's David. We know what you're dealing with, and it's that fear of judgment, that shame, Genesis 3, fall of man, right? It's that idea of shame. We hide, it's this, we know that we're messed up, And instead of going to God and bringing that, in that church loving community that we're supposed to, we hide and in shame. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we do, like in the Christian circles, we like to elevate, and this is something that our pastor kind of talked on a bit this week. But we like to elevate the idea. Oh yeah, God is good. Like things are going well. God is providing for us. He can give us all that we need. All like, and we tend to not to focus so much on the hard things that are going on in our personal lives, and i- in that way we also don't focus on like how God is helping us to change, or helping us to push through the struggles that we have right now. And I think it's definitely a culture thing. I think Western culture, Eastern culture, both cultures have this kind of idea that in Eastern culture, you have the shame and like a lot of respect and kind of this pride of like doing what's right and bringing honor to your family, or to whoever you kind of represent, right? And the Western culture, yeah, that kind of feels like you're independent, but like you represent everything that all of your actions, you represent all of that, and that kind of becomes the judgment on like what kind of person you are. Like if you mess up and if you fail and you have like are not doing well in life, that is reflected. Oh yeah, you didn't put in the proper effort, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. So both cultures kind of come together, and I think in the Christian culture we try to balance that somewhat, but we also don't do a very good job of it, because even within the Christian culture we like this idea of that we're all striving towards God, and we're growing in like our holiness and our righteousness together, and we don't like to talk about the the parts of our lives that are not going well. And I think that in the Christian world, that should be the place where we're able to talk about it. Like the gospel tells us that we're not perfect, and so we don't have to pretend that we're perfect. And we are God's grace is made like even greater in our unrighteousness, right? So not talking about the ways in which we are struggling, you know, because maybe it undermines the power of God's grace a little bit. Um, and I think it's something that as Christians we need to become better at doing, because it not only just for the sake of relationships, for the sake of being able to relate to other people and the struggles that they're going through, to reveal that you yourself are not perfect, and that that's okay, and you can come beside another person who is struggling with other things and say, hey, I'm struggling with these things as well. I'm not perfect, but God's grace is awesome and he's forgiven us, and I'm so grateful to God for doing that, for in that relational way, but also in just it helps us to improve. I think there are some roadblocks in like we're not wanting to talk about the shameful things in our lives, not wanting to talk about the sin things in our lives, and that kind of almost limiting us from growing, because we don't even want to bring it up. We don't want people to know about it. We don't want people to help us with it. We think that we can overcome it ourselves. We think that like it's okay. Don't worry. Like I have this thing that's bad in my life, but I'm not going to share it with anyone because I don't want them to know. And once I get over that hurdle, once I've become perfect and understood it, like what you were saying, David, then I can share that. Oh yeah, God really helped me through this. God, like, but when we're in the moment, we don't want to tell that to people, and it only slows us down in our progress.
Mhm. Yeah, I know, like, Steven has been, like, my number 1 accountability partner, and it's been awesome, like, learning to be honest with another believer, it's like it so radically changes the way that you can start to approach problems, because now it's, like, not just festering within yourself. It's like, it's out in the open, we can pray for each other, we can talk about it, we can come before God together instead of, like, "I'm just gonna do this on my own, I'm good enough to tackle this."
But I
And
don't
hopefully we
also,
can go
when
ahead.
like having accountability partners in these things, like sometimes people feel like I like what you're saying, David. Like if I just share this with someone, that will help. That will be the end. I like, and it's kind of interesting. Like you have to get through like multiple hurdles, kind of. First
It's a
hurdle,
slog.
yeah.
It's a
First
slog.
hurdle is like even being able to say it to someone. I
Mhm.
think that's one thing to overcome. But on top of that, I think there is some kind of um, shame in itself. And once you've shared it with someone, and you have the sense that like you want after you shared it with someone, you have this obligation to all of a sudden like for you and the other person to see changes within like that, you know. And sometimes when there is failure again, you know, there in that accountability in whatever you have shared, it's maybe even harder to bring it on the table because you want to feel like, oh, now that I've shared it with this person and this person has shared their stuff with me, now we're both improving together. And if there's no improvement, you know, that is shameful on its own too. So there, yeah, there's a lot of challenges there.
I want to throw another wrench in what we've been talking about because we know that as Christians, our appearance is actually very important. We've been talking a lot about. Um, I don't want to come off as like overly macho man. I've conquered everything. I'm basically Jesus already. But at the same time, we know that there are a lot of places in the New Testament where they say, like, you need to be blameless before others so that they won't look on you and defame God because of your actions. So, where is this middle ground between like this Second Corinthians 12 idea of like when I am weak, then I am strong, and also trying to maintain this image where we reflect God's holiness?
Yeah, no, that's I think so. I think that comes to a lot of, first of all, thankfully it's not about us, right? So this is actually something that which I've I heard I think it was a podcast or it was a sermon. I can't always remember what it is. It's the 21st century,
In
Gen Z
quarantine, they're the same thing, right?
millennial life, right? It's this of yeah, like we are called to do good, right? Simple as that. And and as Christians, right, we are called to not just like be good people, but like I guess more than good. Like we have a high standard, right? We talked about this, that it's that high standard, and I think the thing is to be the there's a lot of things that we I think already will be doing that isn't necessarily like our failures of not being perfect. I think there are because I think there's how do I say this? There's like outward sins and there's like inwards. Like, right? If I'm going around just like murdering people, that's like okay, let's talk about that. And but if we're talking about like so like let's say I would argue like fundamental baseline sin for everybody is pride, right? I think there's mostly biblical support for that, and pride can rear itself in many different ways, and so we can be real about our issues with pride but one of the ways that we are real about it and one of the ways that we become perfect is by making active decisions to do what is right. And I think that is the power of what the gospel gives us, is that we have now through the Holy Spirit the ability to actually do things correctly, if that makes sense. Previously to before being saved, I guess you could do the right thing, but intentions and why you're doing the right things, or that's always going to be muddled and not correct and aligned with God. I think there's a passage that says for my good works were as like filthy rags or something like that. I don't remember exactly where that is. I'm pretty sure that's in the Bible. Dangerous last words. But um we can still do what we can still make those active choices to do what's right and to work in a righteous way. And both what our heart, so it's our heart versus our actions, and it's not a one-way street there. It's definitely a two-way street. As we do more and more of what is right, that is then our heart begins to change more and more, and as our heart begins to change more and more, then it'll be easier for us to do what's right. I think a lot of times it's like I think most people can relate to this. Like growing up, your parents tell you to do something, you're like, no, that's stupid, you don't see the reason why, but because they're parents, they'll make you do it. Sucks. As you grow older, though, you're still doing those things, but hopefully there's a time where something changes and you see the value in it, and you see what is why you should do it. And as Christians, I think it's similar. I think there's times where we're going to be doing something, service or ministry or reading our Bible, right? We all, as much as we all would like to say that every time I open my Bible, it's like whoosh. That's not always the case, right? That's most of the time. It's pretty mundane. You're like, oh look, David and Goliath, or Book of James, great stuff. But I'm not like being impacted it with each and every day. But to do what's right, you make a practice of that. And I think over time, God uses that to shape our hearts, where, it's that two-way street. And that is, I think, a way that we become perfect, because the New Testament does talk a whole lot about doing good. And I think that's a crucial part. But it's important for us to get that order correct. I think this is Tim Keller who said it. Don't quote me on that. It might be someone else, but redemptive indicatives always preceded moral imperatives, right? Big words there. I think the word moral is the shortest word in that sentence, but the redemptive indicatives, it's right. This is how you were redeemed. This is a fact. This is a statement. You have been saved. Precede moral imperatives. That's the you should, and do this and do that. And that's the critical thing. And I think what Christianity is compared to other uh, cultures and worldviews is that, like we do these good works to become saved, is what the world will tell us, right? Say this, don't do that, don't do that. Whereas for Christians, it's like, hey, look, you've already been saved. Now go and do what's right, with the assurance of that safety net, knowing that if you mess up, because you're going to, that's not like your salvation isn't in jeopardy there. That's just you growing. And I think that's how we can do what's right. And when we don't do what's right, still be fine and still be able to continue on in a healthy way.
Yeah, and for all the things that Jesus tells us about how to live our lives, how to do things right, in the time that he was here ministering to the earth, it's really interesting that the antagonists of the gospel story are the Pharisees, who were pretty much the ones that were like, yeah, I do everything right. I follow all the laws. I fulfill all the Jewish laws. I pray, I give a lot of money to the church. And these were the kind of people that Jesus that we see as kind of like the antagonist of the gospel story. And so I think we see like where the balance is there. I think being uh, prideful and being hypocritical is probably the way that um, is how we can see like when people look at us and look into the Christian world. Like the one thing that we don't want to be is hypocritical. We don't want to pretend like everything is all right. And I think that um, you do want to present like a good view of yourself and of Christianity, because you want other people to know that like Christianity is part of it is standing for what is right. But that we're not perfect in doing that. And that's what I think the Pharisees represented in the Bible. They were people that stood for what is right, but also said like, oh yeah, if you're not like me, if you're not doing all these things, then you ought to be punished. Then there's a whole bunch of like that you ought to repent and the story of Jesus is that we recognize that we're not all right, that we're not all perfect, and that even though we are striving for the perfection, that we understand that it's God's grace that is the ultimate, like the biggest power there. It's not within our own will to like you're to get perfect. It's going to be like God's grace and God's love and God like empowering us to become like that. And uh yeah.
Yeah, I think when we look at the Pharisees, I love that you bring that up. That's such a good example. But for them, I feel like um, their religion was sort of like a checklist. It's like, okay, commandments 1 through 10. Okay, good. Did I love God? Yeah, I read some scriptures. Did I love my neighbor? Yeah, I watered her tomato plant. Okay, we're good. I'm getting to heaven. Um, but when we start to look at this gospel idea and this whole thing that we're talking about of like being a Christian feels impossible, I think that there's a lot of beauty in that because it, in a way, is sort of like forces us on our knees facing the dirt before God. Like now I understand there's no way that I can do this on my own. How do I do this? I do it with God's help. And I think that that's a really beautiful thing because like I love what you said, David. Like pride is pretty much the root of like any sin that you will have, and it's so easy to just be consumed with that. I know that for like a long time, I wanted like Paul uses the phrase like beat my body into submission. I wanted that. I wanted like worldly perfection to be a substitute for accepting God's grace, and to come to a point where I realized that I had to, and then I couldn't like earn it. It's like it's so funny that we like we make fun of everyone else with works based faith, and then when it comes to ourselves, like for myself, I was still trying to earn God's grace, which is ridiculous. And so yeah, just realizing that like it's okay. That's just like the thing I've had to realize. It's okay that I'm not going to get there, but I need to try.
Mhm.
And I think that that's really discouraging in itself. Is like I'm chasing this thing and I know I'm never going to get it. But if I stop running, then there are consequences for that. But just this whole idea of like just you have to try. You just
Yeah.
have to keep running for it.
And I think that really is the other side of the coin. That like, man, like being a good person, like without being saved by Christ, impossible. With being saved by Christ, dang, it's hard, right? It's a slog. It's we're talking about like, let's face it, like most humans hate the idea of self-discipline. American culture hates the idea of self-discipline. And instead of doing self-discipline, we'll just normalize it and make it okay, right? Like, let's be like, for me, like, I love food. I'm trying to lose weight. It's ish okay. But like the American culture, it's like self-care, cheat days, and you're just like, oh yes, like like I just finished this one really hard assignment. I'm gonna allow myself some some food. The next day, I just made it through this day. I'm gonna reward myself, right? And I'm not saying like yes, there's within moderation and everything, but still, right? Like we have like it's we have this such adverse feelings of any type of suffering, and we are willing to like find any way to try to self-medicate out of that kind of suffering. And I think even within like our Christian lives, it's like we do that, and we like we it's like how we're so quick to try and move past like that uncomfortable feeling of sin. Like I think sometimes it's we can in to go the other extreme where we just kind of are too quickly to say like God's grace. And I think one thing like for me, like one of my mentors, like he's like like, do you really hate your sin enough, right? Do you feel that full weight of what it is? And I think sometimes that's really and not sometimes it is really uncomfortable, and you really want to kind of just like get your mind to the next thing. So maybe I'll go find some friends to socialize with, or I'll pull up a video game, or I'll pull up YouTube just to try and take your mind off of it, because it's really uncomfortable to think about. But I think this idea of becoming perfect and becoming more and more like Christ is you have to be willing to really come to terms with the gravity of your sin and be willing to really sit in that and kind of stew in that. And once again, in a healthy way, right? Worldly sorrow leads to death, and godly sorrow leads to, I forgot how it goes. That's also a verse that I know of. I don't remember where it is. My Owana leaders would be so sad. But once again, it's like you need to have, yes, that grace is important, but at the end of the day, right, I think verse 48, Matthew 5:48, which is kind of what we're talking about here, right? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Like that's, I think, sometimes for us, we're reading through this certain amount, we're like, oh snaps, well, that's probably a bit of hyperbole. Flip the page, on to the next thing. Okay, cool, right? But like, no, like he's actually meaning, like, man, you gotta like the whole context is king, right? But in Matthew 5, it's like, do this, don't do this. finalizing with be perfect. And you're like, shoot, he means it, right? He's not just like, there is that drive that, where we really do have to be doing what's right. And when we don't do what's right, First John 1:9, right? If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness, right? I think confess isn't just a hey God, I'm sorry that I did this. Please forgive me. All right, we cool. Anyway, back to what I was doing, right? Like it does require that like really intense, visceral feeling. I think many times of like this is what's wrong with me, of that brokenness, and like you're not going to want the food if you're not hungry, if you don't really come to terms with how broken you are, and if everything that you're doing is self-medicating with this grace, which is important. Yes, God's grace is important, but if we don't really realize how horrible our current sin is, then over time grace just kind of loses its meaning, and the gospel loses its meaning, because we're like, oh yeah, I'm saved. Like, oh yeah, God's grace covers everything. Oh, God's great grace is good, you know. But there is still that like, be perfect, right? And that's what we need to be striving for, and not just like, that's probably a bit of an overstatement. He can't really expect us to do that. So yeah.
And yeah, I think when now so now we're seeing both sides of the coin and trying to figure out like how to balance the two. And I think it's very dependent on like how that person is viewing their faith and their walk. For the person that is um struggling with their sin and like feels like they're just terrible and feels like they cannot come before God and they cannot confess it to another person because they want to have this kind of they want people to perceive them as like doing well and improving and like reaching perfection. Our approach should be to come alongside with them and say, hey, you know what, it's fine to be struggling with this, it's fine, it's okay to not be all there, but God's grace is there regardless. So keep on doing that, like keep on striving for protection, but knowing that like God is there to meet you like wherever you are and to help you to grow. And for the person that is on the other side of the coin, the person that feels like, oh yeah, okay, I've got grace, like don't worry about it, like, oh, these things are maybe bad in my life, but God's grace is all there, and I have my forgiveness Fridays. I think for that person, you have to say, okay, you need to realize that sin is not something to be played around with. It's not something that you say, okay, well, I guess I'll take a cheat day like today, or I'll take because I've been doing really well for a week, or for like I just had a really hard test. Maybe I'll just take a cheat day. It's something that comes and like wraps around you and really strangleholds you. And the more and more sin that you have and that you just kind of like let go and think of as not a bad thing, the more it kind of entangles you. And I really like over a couple of weeks ago, we had our college retreat, and I was listening to one of the speakers talk about mental health and kind of how to get out of a bad mindset. And the way she put it was that every time you kind of go back into that mindset or let yourself get wrapped up in that, it's not a big shift. It's not like 0 to 100%. It's 1% each time. And then the more and more you kind of let that slowly creep into your life, it drops 1%, 1%, 1%. But if you kind of turn away from that and come back to God's grace and God's holiness and want to kind of pursue that and really rid yourself of the sin, the struggles that you have in your life, it's not going to be a 0 to 100%, but it's gonna be that 1%. It's gonna be that 1%, 1%. And every time you find yourself in that struggle and you win, you know, like both don't think that it's the end of the battle and that all of a sudden you won, because Satan has like really crafty ways that he's gonna attack you again and again and again, and you're gonna have to fight against that. But like think of it as like, yeah, that 1%. Like I am slowly, um winning. I'm slowly winning the war. And I think so yeah, when we talk about sin, when we talk about grace, we have to have those two separate approaches depending on how that person views the gospel, how we ourselves view that gospel, and understand that it's going to be an uphill battle. It's not going to be easy. No one ever, Jesus never said it was going to be easy, that it was just all going to come to us. Some people have different struggles with sin that other people do not. We don't all have the same struggles. Some people are more alcoholism. Some people are more predisposed to that, to pornography. Some people struggle with that a lot more than other people. So we're not going to have the same sin battles, but like Satan really knows how to get us where we're going to hurt the most. And we just have to trust in God that he's going to bring us out of it, and that we have to keep on working at it, even if it's just that 1%, and it feels like nothing's changing, and feels like sin is still hard to get over. It's just going to be that small victories, those small victories, and eventually, hopefully, we'll not on this world, but like in heaven, we're going to be in perfection there.
I think also like I think in a lot of I think Christianity, especially kind of think I kind of had this view growing up, and I think it's somewhat common is, you view like this life on earth as like, oh gosh darn it, I could only be in heaven, right? And it's like heaven is like everyone likes to be like heaven is like the end goal. I remember when I used to like talk about like the gospel, it's like, why should you accept Jesus? You accept Jesus because you want to go to heaven. And that's true. That is very true. Heaven is, the culmination. But one thing that I've done a lot of kids ministry, and one thing that one of my mentors taught me, she was like what you want to be telling kids is that is like life with Jesus starts now and lasts forever. And this journey that we have here on this earth, like, is not going to be as like necessarily as like glorious as what heaven's going to be, but it's really important, right? It's this is we our time here on this earth for as many or as few years that as that is crucial in our relationship with Christ and our growing. Like that is it's and you don't want to blow this out into like a humanistic, view of like, oh, humans, we're this glorified, magnified beings. But like it isn't, this our life on earth isn't just some curse that we're trying to get over as quickly as possible so we can get into heaven. Like this is a very important part in who we are and what we will become. And as we approach that, and with that more proper understanding, as we approach this idea of perfection versus imperfection, I think that's a much healthier place to look at, whether it's like this, oh, I'm always just going to be this doomed person on earth, or on the other side, I was like, oh, it doesn't matter because I'm just going to be glorified in heaven, right? It's like this is still these years and these days and these moments, hours, seconds that we're living in are very important in our growth in Christ. And what we do here really, I think, does have, does make a difference in what type of people we will become and how we will, contribute to God's kingdom. So, yeah, and so we should strive to be perfect, and whether that's being able to accept that I'm never going to be as perfect as I want to be, or that I'm a lot less perfect than I think I am, it's that important understanding of like this life here on earth is really, really still important, and not just some flippant thing that we're kind of casting off and we're like, get that thing behind me. It's heaven time, baby.
Yeah. Um, it, we talk about this like, oh, accept Jesus, live for God, and you'll be able to spend eternity with God. And there's the concept, you're right, it's like eternity starts when I die, but like eternity starts now. It's like it's all time, it's not later, it's now. So yeah, that is really important.
And it's never too late.
Correct. It's never too late. um yeah, but so I guess just to give, we've presented a lot of sides, and if you're listening, I'm sure it's been confusing as we've explored different sides of different three-sided coins, and I don't even know what we've been talking about. But I guess just to give you something a little bit more tangible to apply, I was thinking about this, um, sort of the approach that we should have in this battle. One of the most important things that my mentor has said to me, it's really short, but it's so good. It's just like, stay hungry, stay humble. And if I can add another H word to that, I think honest is really important for fighting this battle. And I think no matter where you find yourself, it's like am I hungry for God? Okay, yes, I want to pursue righteousness. Am I not hungry for God? Okay, this is a problem. This is a foothold for the devil, to realize that I'm not passionate about pursuing Jesus. Um, am I humble? I think that this is what we were talking about earlier with the Pharisees, and especially if you're in a position of leadership. Like one of my favorite call outs from the Bible is Jesus saying, like, you Pharisees, you pray on the street corners so that people will see you. No, go pray in your room, like behind a closed door. And I think that's really important. It's like, okay, am I humble? Do I have a right perspective on why I'm doing these things? I should be blameless. We should strive for that, as the New Testament, as Paul tells us. But at the same time, I want to be humble in that, right? I don't want to try and project this image onto others so that they know. I want it to be something that they see of me. Just
On that, I want to ask, because like as we kind of close, I want to put this into very more like practical terms. Or I think all of us will come from the side of um, feeling like it's hard to show the imperfections that we have. All of us are in some kind of leadership, right, within our ministries. Like, how do you suggest that we go about that? You know, because we can't like stand from our whatever leadership and say like, oh yeah, actually today you're gonna learn about everything that's bad about me. I mean, maybe, you know, but like, how do you think we should like practically apply that and show others that we're not perfect?
that takes me to my third H, actually.
Okay, all
Thank you,
right.
Stephen. Yeah, and just I think being honest is like the third crucial part of that. Because like you're saying, I don't want to go up on the podium in front of Grant Avenue Baptist Church and say, this week I did this, and I looked up this, and I said this
Right,
mean
it's
thing.
not like confession before the priest, right?
Right, right. I don't think that's like, I just don't think we're called to do that. But um, like James 5, it says, confess your sins to each other and pray that you might be healed. I think that's really important. And we talked about accountability partners earlier. I think when it comes to it, like when you have that opportunity to be honest, because like these things will come up naturally. Like sin is just like a thing. And so when you always have a choice, it's like, I can bring this up or I can continue like projecting my macho perfection. And I think it's important that we make the conscious choice to be honest. And it's like it's not just like lying, like, did you do a bad thing this week? No, I didn't. I think that part of the honesty is also not withholding truth when you feel like it's a good time to share that. And so um yeah, and that requires being vulnerable, which is hard, but um, this is like vulnerability and honesty. This is like a culture change that I've been wanting to see a lot, and I've had a lot of amazing conversations with like fellow dudes just about sin and like how are you doing? Like, can we work through this together for myself and for them? And maybe if it doesn't make it to like the large scale, like we're going to talk about it in front of 80 people on Thursday night, because I don't think that's what it's supposed to be. I still think that we should do our best to um, sort of
To
propagate a culture
change the
where
culture, yeah.
yeah, where we can be honest and we don't feel like we need to hide our imperfections.
You know, and I think a lot of that comes from to talk about like being on leadership and and what as a leader, right? You lead by classic saying, right? You lead by example, and it's that I think when we're talking about like for a newer Christian, right? For let's say that you're a let's say you're a brand new freshman, you know, walking into your pod, or whatever pod means, because that's a weird name with some weird noun in front of it. And you're sitting there and you probably feel a little bit uncomfortable because you don't really know what's going on. And what are they going to see? And now, not obviously not just in small groups, right? And are they just going to see a whole bunch of people who sit down and talk about this God and use big words, which I'm very guilty of, and it's just like, or are they going to see like people who are real about becoming better people, and who are not only becoming better people people, but doing about it in a very real way. And I think that's going to shape then how, this trickle down thing, trickle down economics.
No,
No,
no.
um, tangent, but no, but it's this, it's like, what is, like, do they view like the leaders of the church, of a small group, of whatever, as like these untouchable moral authority figures, which you think about, like, that's what the Pharisees were portraying themselves as. It's like, we're these perfect people, and in doing so, these moral authority teachers figures are like building a wall because they're probably uncomfortable and they don't want to be like ratted out for being honest. So they do all these things. So it's kind of like how could you even dare question our, or are we going to be like just in what we talk about, right? In the examples that we use, in how we talk about, how we talk about sin. Is it just, is it just like all these big sins that everybody knows? Or is it like, being honest in our conversations, like, oh yeah, like the other day, and like, yeah, and like this is really what's going on. And I think it's that realism in a culture where everything is moving to be so filtered and fake, right? Everyone's trying to put their best side forward and keep everything that's not good to themselves, right? We see that on like a lot of social media platforms. Are we going to be willing to, when we're with people, to be like that, honest and humble and do those things together, and not in a way that's like honest but as like a masquerade of like, like, but I'm still like really good because I'm sharing all these things. But it's like, yeah, I'm actually struggling with this. This is something that like I'm still having a hard time getting over, because I think it's that getting over it. It's like, oh yeah, we all know that sin's bad, but what's the really sucky part is it's been 3 years and I'm still dealing with the sin, and I'm still not like, that's the shameful part, right? I think Stephen, you alluded to that earlier. But are we willing to be that honest so that other people who maybe are newer in the faith, or who might feel a little bit shakier, can say, oh, I'm not just this horrible defective Christian who can't do things right. Like, this experience isn't just me being a really bad deficient person. This is common, and together we can work together to become better people in God's church and his community.
Hmm. Yeah. So just being open, being honest, I think it's so important. And yeah, I guess that is the application. Just hungry, humble, honest, just trying to pursue God. Real quickly, if I can share one more illustration that my pod came up with at pod retreat. It's we talked about idols this past winter, and um, we talked about how, like, so we were at the beach, so this seemed appropriate. If you dig a hole deep enough in the sand, it fills up with water, and that water is like the sin, and it's like, okay, I need to get the sin out. So you start scooping the water out. Okay, well, what happens? It just keeps filling back up to the top. So how do I keep the water out? You got to fill it with something, and that something is Jesus. And so I think, as much as we talk about the sin, um, it's like the sin is like a consequence of when we don't like pursue Jesus with everything. So as we sort of go out of this topic, I think that should hopefully be the number one thing on our minds. It's not like avoid the sin so that I don't even have to worry about this. It's like, I'm going to pursue Jesus, and I'm going to let Jesus take care of this. And I'm going to let him fill me with himself, the Holy Spirit. And hopefully that will be to the exclusion of sin. And we know that, like, we are never going to be rid of sin. We've discussed this. We're never going to truly be like Jesus until we go to heaven. But it's like, this is the ideal that we should be striving for.
And that it's a journey and it takes time. And I think that's the other thing. It's not something that, it's not as much as I think every Christian in the world wishes that it was like a light switch of like, click, this is more of a dimmer bulb, and it takes time for that change to happen. And it will take, some sins, yeah, it can be fast, but other sins will take years. And it can be really discouraging, but it's that understanding that Christ is the one who is motivating that change, not you, not your desire to do what's right. Because let's be honest, our desire to do what's right isn't always on. A lot of times they're like, I want to sin. That's what I want to do right now, right? But Christ in his perfection is the one who's doing that change, not our whims. And I think that's that key to being able to healthily know that you're not going to be perfect, but still strive to be perfect. Is that at the end of the day, it's not about you and your willpower and your actions. It's about Christ who loved you when you were spitting in his face, crucifying him on the cross. He loved you, and that is where that change will happen. That is where that will come from.
Yeah, it's funny. I think Jason, you shared another like rock sand analogy when we were talking last week.
Oh no!
Talking about like putting in the important things first, like putting the rocks in first, and all the sand will fill up. And then now this week we've got another sand water analogy.
Stay tuned for next week's sand analogy.
Hey, you guys can talk about our foundation.
Oh yeah.
Easy parable tie in there.
Yeah, but I think yeah, if you're in that kind of, I love, yeah, I love what you just said, David, and how it's a continually building a process. It's not going to be the light switch, and if you're in that kind of position where you're able to make the change in culture, hopefully, as you're listening to us, that's going to be very hard. It's going to be very hard to change the culture that has we've constantly grown up with. We've kind of been taught not only just within the Christian world, but from parents and friends, and this kind of idea of trying to be perfect and in our lives in school. It's so rooted within us that's kind of like perfect culture and wanting to present the best of yourself. And if you have the ability to, if you're a small group leader, if you're some kind of leader in the church, and you want to create this environment where people are okay with talking about it, I think it will be hard. And to just be wise and you're talking about it. It's not, like we said, it's not gonna be something that you can just flip all of a sudden and everyone's gonna be like, oh, okay, today, small group, today we're gonna be talking about all the sins in our lives. And you know what? Every week from now, let's just start with that. It's like, no.
2-hour confessional period.
Yeah,
lay it all out.
All right, today we're gonna be like Alcoholics Anonymous. It's like, no, you're not gonna be able to change the culture that quickly. But if you have that idea in your head and you want that change, and you slowly kind of try to create that culture, whatever part, even if you're not a leader, whatever part of the church you're in, whatever part of the community you're in, you want to start opening up. It might be just first you yourself have to open up to a friend or open up to someone that you trust in, and then get that person on board. And if you guys understand that kind of struggle, the what you would see your vision, for your community, then start, sharing with other people and kind of building this change person by person, and then whatever community you're in, that like you slowly start to change the culture and allow people to see that it's okay to not be perfect. And hopefully, like, the end goal or something, the vision that I would like to see, for our college ministry, is a place where people that is like they're so comfortable with saying where they did not go right, where there was sin, and that everyone will be able to rally behind that person and encourage them, to make the change, to like to help them in what they're struggling, and just like encourage them to grow in Christ together. That would be like the end goal, but it's not going to happen so quickly. It's not something that we can change in just a day, a week, a month, maybe like not even years sometimes. But like, as long as we have that on our minds and we want to see that change, I think as we slowly kind of try to change the culture, um, we'll, in whatever way that we try to do it, um, it's good to just like keep on, like, to try that and to have that in our mind. And um it's for the best, right? It's not for our own selves. It's not something that just like is a selfish ambition, because I think that this change really will have an impact on people's relationships with God and how they see their own personal relationship with God.
Mm-hmm. And if we haven't already made it clear, I won't speak for David because he's our flyby guest, but Stephen and I, like within Epic, we're, hopefully David, you're on board with this too, but we want to be drivers of this change as well. So it's not like we're just saying like, you go do it. Like, we want to be part of this too. And hopefully this is a conversation that we'll continue to have. So like, For sure, hit us up, and we want to be open and genuine with you guys too, and we will do our best to be honest people, to help you, to encourage you, to be encouraged by you guys. So, yeah, like if you're watching this, this starts now. Let's make a
and
change.
and celebrate the joys of someone overcoming the temptation,
Amen.
overcoming a sin.
Yes.
Don't always don't always make it when someone does sin, coming back, and I feel like, oh yeah, like sympathizing with it, but like also celebrate the joyous parts when there was like, oh, I had this temptation to sin this other day, but I like put it behind me, and I decided not to. That's something worth celebrating, and I feel like we also don't do enough of that in our groups.
For sure, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. All
All
right, Steven,
right.
you want to take us out of here?
Cool. Thank you so much, David, for joining us. You have like awesome insight on all of this, and it's been really great talking with you.
Yeah, I'm glad that I could swing by in our virtual conversations, but it's been great. Yeah, and I really hope that for all the listeners out there, no matter where you are on that side of the coin, no matter where you are on that dimmer switch, just really remember that once again, it's Christ's work through you.
Mm.
And that's for every aspect of every topic that we could ever come up with, is that, at the end of the day, social justice issues, personal issues, all these things, it's Christ needs to be that driving factor. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah, definitely. Well, if you, the listener, if you have some kind of insight or something you would like to share with us, feel free to leave it in the comments below. We would love to talk about these things with you. If you would like to guest on the podcast, we would certainly love to have you as well. You can fill out the business inquiry below. And also next week, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the podcasts and answering some questions. So if you have any question you would like us to answer, feel free to leave in the comments. You can send it to us directly if you know us. But yeah, other than that, Jason, do you have anything that you would like to say?
Yeah, just one more time. Thanks again, David, and I can't wait to talk about sand again next week.
Sweet. We'll get another sand analogy out there.
Sponsored by sand.
Yeah.
Or rock.
Rocks and sands. Yeah. Oh, we can talk about the parable of the man who builds his house.
Yeah, that's what David was saying
Oh
earlier.
yeah.
We'll have to hit that one up next week.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us, and we will catch you again next week.